Howl. Outside the cabin, the wind howled through the trees, while inside, the old woman's fire was nearly out. At least, she hoped it was the wind and not the wolves. The wood was low, the temperature was dropping, and her son was not yet back from the village market. Arthur always told her that her cottage was too far from the village, too far into the woods to be safe, left to her own devices. But Dorothea was an old hand at everything required to live in the woods, and no matter how frail her son thought her to be, she was not yet so old as to be required to be looked after. Now don't get her wrong, she appreciated Arthur's help and company very much, but he has grown and has a family of his own now, despite the small part of her soft heart that will always see him as her little boy. But back to the point at hand, the day was growing old, the air growing colder, and her fire was just about out. The howling wind prevented her from hearing whether Arthur was coming up the trail with the handcart yet, but either way, Dorothea was going to get some wood for herself. She was still perfectly capable, thank you very much. So she wrapped herself in her thickest woolen shawl, and tucking the ends in her belt, she hiked the wood basket onto her back with one hand, and with the other picked up the old oil lantern. It may only just be getting dark, but even she can admit that her eyesight in dim lighting simply isn't what it used to be, so lantern it is. And a good thing it is, because as she pulls the door shut behind her, slamming a few times to get it to stay, she must remind Arthur of his promise to fix the old frame before winter really sets in proper. Dorothea sees that the day seems to have very suddenly grown quite dark quite quickly since she last checked out the window for any signs of Arthur. The whipping wind makes her grateful for her heavy woolen shawl as she trudges the few hundred feet to the left of her cottage, to the woodshed where a good supply has already been cut and stacked for her by Arthur. Her son was a very good boy. And as Dora stacks wood and kindling in the basket, she worries to herself whether Arthur was dressed warmly enough for this wind and encroaching cold weather. She knows he has a bad habit of never dressing warm enough for the weather outside, saying he'll keep warm by working, never admitting that he's cold. He got that stubborn inability to admit when he's wrong from his father. Dorothy is sure she's not that bad, so she often worries for him, and childishly hopes his own child will come to be just as stubborn and proud, so he learns just what it's like. After some strategic stacking and filling, the wood basket is full. Overfull, if she's being honest, but it's far too cold to come back out for more wood later when it's even darker still, so she'll just have to bear the weight. It's not that far, and she's not doing this in 2 trips. Hefting the basket onto her now bent back, she huffs and puffs her way to the cottage, no longer quiet as she was before. Kicking the door open in its crooked frame, she places the basket in its nook by the door. As Dorothea goes to close the door behind her, she pauses, realizing that she took her time getting the load of wood. It was not quite dark, and her son still wasn't back, nor could she see or hear any sign of the noisy cart coming up the trail to her cottage. Suddenly worried again, Dorothea quickly refills her lantern, and closing the door behind her, starts down the path. It's probably unwise to go looking for Arthur right this moment, but no matter how old she gets and how grown her son is now, she will always have that motherly instinct to go and make sure he's safe. "He's probably just gotten sidetracked picking flowers for his wife," Dora tells herself. "It's gotten dark quite suddenly after all, and I'm not sure he took a lantern with him, saying he'd be back before nightfall. Maybe he took a wrong turn on the trail." Again the worry bubbles in her chest, and unease prickles along her spine as the wind, while still blowing, suddenly seems quite soundless and definitely softer than moments before. Dorothea isn't cold any more, despite the season. No, in fact, she can feel sweat gathering on the back of her neck as she trudges along the path, her footsteps seeming quite cacophonous in the ominous quiet of the wood. After some time walking, Dora stops to think. She'd estimate that she'd walked long enough along the path to be at least 1/3 of the way to the village by now, and assuming Arthur simply left the village market at closing instead of earlier, she still should have come across him by now. Even lugging a cart full of supplies, the walk would not take that long without intersection. Going back to one of her previous ideas, rationalizations, that he'd simply taken a wrong turn on the path in the fading light, she resolutely ignored the voice in her head that sounded an awful lot like her husband, reminding her that the trail from the cottage to the village had no forks to turn down. Dorothea should call his name. If he'd simply strayed from the path, Or perhaps one of the wheels of the handcart hit a stone and broke, and he's attempting to fix it, and that's why she hasn't seen him yet. Then calling his name would tell him that she's out here looking for him, that he should just come home with her, and they'd sort out the cart tomorrow in the daylight, of which there was none left, and it was now truly night dark. The lantern's light radius not all that good, but not wanting to lengthen the wick for more light in case she needs the oil. So Dorothea swallowed to wet her dry mouth, and ignoring her trepidation, called out for her son. "Arthur!" The second the sound left her lips, she knew somehow that she'd made a mistake. From the darkness of the trees to her right came a low, vicious growl. Her heart briefly stopped, and then jumped into her throat to beat in her head, a rhythmic, panicked beat of run, run, run. As Dorothea turned on her heel, her racing thoughts and sudden tunnel vision registered something for the first time. The clouds, which had obscured the night sky for most of her walk, in a suddenly returning chilling gust of wind, moved out of the way of the moon, which shone brightly down on the path. There, less than 100 feet from the path, right in the border of the trees, half hidden behind the great trunk of an oak that was splattered with blood that suddenly seemed like a red lantern light splitting the dark, was an upturned handcart. And the growling became a howl, which seemed to echo in front and behind and around on all sides, but ever so noticeably louder, directly behind her. It wasn't the wind after all.